The sun was shining brightly as Charlotte left school, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment after another day of guiding her young students. The laughter of children echoed in her mind, a testament to the joy she found in her work. At home, the comforting aroma of dinner prepared by her loving husband greeted her, and the warmth of their small, happy life filled her heart with contentment. But the next day, everything changed. A small, fearful boy named Brian entered her classroom, and Charlotte's peaceful world was turned upside down by the weight of his silent struggles. As Brian's story unfolded, Charlotte's heart broke for the boy who had faced so much more than any child should. Her once simple and happy life became a mission to protect Brian, and the emotions that followed led her from hope to heartbreak, from despair to determination. In the end, it wasn't just Brian who found hope, but Charlotte as well, as she realized the power of compassion and the strength of standing by those who need it most. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. A young boy pleaded desperately not to leave school with his uncle, his eyes wide with fear. Sensing something deeply unsettling, the teacher couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Driven by a gnawing concern, she made the decision to discreetly follow them, her heart pounding with anxiety as she trailed behind them all the way to their home. What she discovered upon reaching the house would forever be etched in her memory, leaving her utterly shaken to the core. Charlotte, the devoted preschool teacher, carefully locked the classroom door, releasing a weary yet satisfied sigh. Another day successfully navigated, she murmured to herself, a blend of accomplishment and exhaustion weighing on her. The life of a preschool teacher was nothing short of an emotional whirlwind, filled with moments of pure joy, heartache, and the constant challenge of nurturing young minds. From a tender age, she had always envisioned herself in this role, guiding and shaping the future generation. As she strolled through the familiar school corridors, her thoughts wandered back to the day's activities. She pondered whether the children had been as enchanted by the story she had shared as she had hoped. "I must find more books like that one," she mused, determined to captivate their imaginations even more. The path to her car was well worn, one she had taken countless times in the 6 years since she first became a part of the Sunshine School family. Arriving home, Charlotte was greeted by the comforting aroma of a lovingly prepared meal. Jason, her ever-thoughtful husband, had once again taken care of dinner, despite his own long hours at work. He never misses a beat. She thought with a smile, her heart swelling with gratitude as she spotted her favorite stew simmering on the stove. Warming up the meal, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. "Jason, you truly have a way of lifting my spirits after a day like today," she whispered softly, feeling the warmth of his love in every bite. Jason may not have been a renowned chef in El Paso, but his passion for cooking was undeniable. Every meal he crafted was an expression of his deep affection for Charlotte, a tangible way to show her how much he cared. For Jason, cooking was more than a chore, it was an act of love, a way to ensure that Charlotte always felt cherished and comforted after the demands of her day. Their opposing work schedules, Charlotte busy with her students during the day and Jason tending to his restaurant in the evening, meant their time together was often fleeting. Yet they both held on to a shared dream, a vision of a future where they could purchase a larger home and finally start the family they longed for. It was this dream that kept them going, fueling their determination to push through the long hours apart. As she sat down to dinner, Charlotte's mind wandered to her students and the challenges they faced. "I need to find a new approach to teaching math," she thought, chewing slowly as ideas began to form. "Maybe I can incorporate more games. Children always respond so well to games," she concluded, feeling a spark of inspiration. After finishing her meal, Charlotte turned her attention to grading the day's activities. "Let's see how everyone did today," she said aloud, opening the first book. She took her time with each one, carefully noting the progress and struggles of her students. "Timothy is really improving with his writing, but Anna needs more support in math," she reflected, adding stars and words of encouragement in the margins. Each note was a reminder of her commitment to their growth, and as she worked late into the night, her love for teaching only deepened. After meticulously finishing the grading, a wave of exhaustion washed over Charlotte, heavy and undeniable. She glanced at the clock, realizing that Jason was still hours away from coming home. Normally, she would wait up for him, cherishing those quiet moments they had together at the end of the day. But tonight, her fatigue was too overpowering. Deciding not to resist the pull of sleep, she quickly tidied up her things, left a small note for Jason on the kitchen counter, and made her way to bed. The softness of the pillow welcomed her, and she drifted off almost instantly, her body grateful for the rest. The next morning, Charlotte awoke feeling refreshed, her energy renewed for the day ahead. As she walked into her classroom, she felt a sense of anticipation for another day filled with laughter, learning, and the endless curiosity of her students. The morning was off to a great start, with the children eagerly singing along to a new song she had introduced. Their voices filled the room with joy, and Charlotte couldn't help but smile as she conducted their little choir. Her contentment was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Turning around, she saw Dr. Michael Brown, the school principal, standing in the doorway with a boy by his side. "Charlotte, could I have a moment with you?" he asked in his calm, authoritative voice. Curious, Charlotte followed Dr. Brown to his office, the boy trailing behind them silently. Once inside, Dr. Brown introduced the new student. "This is Brian," he said, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's small shoulder. Brian stood there, his posture timid, dressed in clothes that were simple but clean. His eyes remained downcast, avoiding any direct contact. "Brian will be joining your class starting today," Dr. Brown continued, his voice gentle, as if trying to soothe the nervousness that was evident in the boy. Charlotte, ever the nurturing soul, knelt down to meet Brian at eye level. She offered him a warm, inviting smile. "Welcome, Brian. We're so happy to have you with us," she said, her voice soft and full of kindness. But Brian barely responded, only offering a small nod in acknowledgement, his eyes still averted. Dr. Brown gave Charlotte a nod, signaling it was time for her to take Brian to his new classroom. "Of course, Dr. Brown," she said before turning to Brian. "Come on, let's go meet your new classmates," she added, extending her hand toward him. He hesitated, but eventually took her hand, his grip light and uncertain. As they walked back into the classroom, Charlotte could feel the curious gazes of the other children. She cleared her throat and addressed the class with her usual enthusiasm. "Everyone, we have a new friend joining us today," she announced, gently encouraging Brian to step forward. "This is Brian. Let's make him feel welcome." The children, in unison, greeted him with a cheerful hello. Brian, though they were eager to meet him, Brian only offered a timid wave in return, still trying to find his footing in this unfamiliar space. The day moved on, and Charlotte made a conscious effort to involve Brian in the class activities. She noticed how quietly he worked, always staying on the periphery of the group, not yet ready to fully engage. As she walked around the room, checking on the students' progress, something caught her eye: Brian's notebook. It was old and frayed, the edges worn from too much use. Inside, only a few blank pages remained, and the rest were filled with cramped handwriting. The concern welled up in Charlotte's chest as she approached his desk. Kneeling beside him, she spoke softly, not wanting to embarrass him in front of the others. "Brian, don't you have a new notebook for the start of the year?" she asked gently, her voice full of care. Brian looked up at her for the first time, and in his brown eyes, Charlotte saw a sadness that no child should ever have to carry. His voice was barely above a whisper as he replied, "This is all I have, teacher." His words hung in the air, filled with a quiet resignation that tugged at Charlotte's heart. Without hesitation, Charlotte stood up and walked to her locker. She pulled out a brand new notebook, still wrapped in its protective cover. Returning to Brian's desk, she placed it in front of him with a warm smile. "Here, Brian, "You can use this one," she said, hoping to lift his spirits, even just a little. Brian looked at the notebook, then back at Charlotte, his expression softening for the briefest moment. Though he didn't say much, the gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. Charlotte gave him an encouraging smile, knowing that this small gesture was only the beginning of helping Brian feel safe and supported in his new environment. Brian's small hands clutched the new notebook as he gazed at it, a faint flicker of light igniting in his eyes. "Thank you, teacher," he whispered, so softly that Charlotte had to strain to hear him. The moment was fleeting, but it gave her hope that perhaps she had reached him, even if just a little. Later, during recess, Charlotte stood by the window, watching the children laughing and running around in the yard. But her eyes kept drifting toward one figure, sitting alone on the edge of the playground. Brian was hunched over, drawing on the ground with a piece of chalk, seemingly lost in his own world. The sight tugged at her heartstrings. She turned to Anna, a fellow teacher who was also keeping an eye on the children. "I'm worried about Brian," Charlotte said quietly, her concern evident in her voice. "He's always by himself. He doesn't seem to want to join the others." Anna glanced over at the solitary boy, then back at Charlotte with a reassuring smile. "It's normal, Charlotte. He just arrived. Sometimes it takes a while for new kids to find their place. Give him some time." Despite Anna's words, Charlotte's worry lingered. She couldn't shake the image of Brian sitting there alone, drawing in the dust while the other children played together. Maybe she thought to herself, "I should do more to help him feel included." When the bell rang, signaling the end of recess, Charlotte gathered the children back into the classroom. As she did, she noticed that Brian was the last to rise, carefully collecting his few belongings and placing them with precision into his worn-out backpack. The sight of the faded bag only deepened Charlotte's concern. She approached him as he stood up, offering a gentle smile. "Brian, I noticed your drawing during recess," she said, her voice warm and encouraging. "You're very talented. Would you like to show your drawings to the class one day?" Brian paused, his eyes widening at the unexpected compliment. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but then he shook his head no, avoiding her gaze, and walked toward the door without a word. Charlotte watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of his silence. She could sense that Brian was carrying more than just a shy demeanor. There was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As the school day drew to a close, the familiar chaos of children gathering their things and heading home filled the classroom. Charlotte stood by her desk, watching the students stream out the door in a whirlwind of backpacks and laughter. But her attention was drawn to Brian, who moved slowly, deliberately, as if he were in no rush to leave. She watched him make his way toward the school gate, his small frame almost swallowed by the world around him. From her vantage point, Charlotte saw an older man approach Brian at the gate. The man's clothes were simple, much like Brian's, and his posture was weary, as if life had taken its toll on him. He placed a hand on Brian's shoulder, guiding him toward an old car parked nearby. Brian climbed into the passenger seat, and the man followed. Charlotte stood there, watching as the car pulled away, disappearing down the road. A lingering thought crossed her mind. Was this man Brian's father? There was something about their interaction that didn't sit right with her, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. That evening, when Charlotte arrived home, she was greeted by the comforting aroma of Jason's cooking. He had the day off and had decided to treat them both to one of his favorite recipes. As she walked into the kitchen, Jason turned to her with a warm smile, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Hey, love," he said, his voice filled with affection. "How was your day?" Charlotte sighed, feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. She smiled back at Jason, grateful for his constant support, but her thoughts were still with Brian. "It was eventful," she replied, her voice trailing off as she leaned against the counter. "There's this new student in my class, Brian. He's so quiet, so withdrawn. I can't stop worrying about him." Jason's expression softened as he listened. "I'm sure you're doing everything you can to help him," he reassured her. "Sometimes kids just need time to open up." Charlotte nodded, but the image of Brian's sad eyes and worn notebook stayed with her, haunting her thoughts even as she tried to focus on the present. As much as she wanted to help him, she knew that some things couldn't be fixed with just a smile and a new notebook. Charlotte sat on the kitchen counter, her mind preoccupied with the image of Brian. As Jason stirred something delicious in the pot, she began to speak. "The day was all right, but there's a new student in my class, Jason. His name is Brian. He seems so lonely, and his things, they're so worn out. Today, I noticed he didn't even have a proper notebook to write in." Jason paused, turning to face her, concern etched on his face. "It's heartbreaking to think that a child doesn't have what he needs to learn," he said thoughtfully. "Do you know anything about his family?" Charlotte shook her head slowly, replaying the scene in her mind. "Not much, honestly. I did see a man pick him up today, though. He looked like he could be his father, but I'm not sure. They drove off in an old car, and Brian, well, he's very quiet today. I gave him a new notebook because the one he had was almost completely used up. You should have seen the way his face lit up, even if just for a moment." Jason nodded, his expression softening as he reached out and placed a reassuring hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "You always go above and beyond for your students, Charlotte. I'm sure with time Brian will open up to you. Just keep doing what you're doing." As they continued talking, Charlotte felt a complex mixture of emotions welling up inside her: concern, determination, and a deep sense of responsibility. She had always known that being a teacher meant more than just delivering lessons. It meant being a source of support, understanding, and care for every child who crossed her path. And Brian was no exception. She silently promised herself that she would find a way to reach him, to help him, no matter how long it took. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at school earlier than usual, eager to face the day and keep an eye on Brian. She stood by the entrance, watching the children file into the building, their faces full of energy and anticipation for the day ahead. But Brian was nowhere to be seen. Charlotte's concern grew with each passing minute until finally she saw him walking toward the school. As he drew closer, her heart sank. His clothes were noticeably dirty, and his small hands were smudged with grime. Even his nails were unclean, and Charlotte couldn't help but wonder what kind of environment he was living in. She knew she had to find out more about his situation, but for now, she could only offer him the stability and kindness he seemed to desperately need. During recess, as the other children eagerly pulled out their colorful lunches, Charlotte's eyes once again found Brian. He sat alone, quietly taking out a squashed piece of bread from his faded backpack. The contrast between his meager snack and the other children's plentiful meals struck Charlotte deeply. She couldn't just stand by and watch. She remembered the sandwich Jason had lovingly prepared for her that morning. Without hesitation, she reached into her bag, pulled out the sandwich, and walked over to where Brian sat. "Brian," she said softly, kneeling down beside him. "I brought an extra sandwich today. Would you like to have it?" Brian glanced up at her, his face flushing with embarrassment. He hesitated, shaking his head in refusal, but Charlotte wasn't about to give up. "It's really tasty," she encouraged with a gentle smile. "I'm sure you'll like it." After a moment, Brian reluctantly accepted the sandwich. As he began to eat, Charlotte could see just how hungry he was. Each bite seemed to bring him a little relief. Sensing an opportunity to connect, she decided to gently ask about his home life. "Brian," she began softly, "that man who picks you up from school, is he your father?" Brian's chewing slowed, and his eyes dropped to the ground. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's my uncle. I don't know who my father is." Charlotte felt her heart tighten painfully at his words. There was so much sadness in that simple admission, and it made her realize that Brian's world was far more complicated than she had initially thought. She sat down next to him, hoping to offer some comfort in this quiet moment. "You can talk to me any time you want, Brian," she said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his small shoulder. "I'm here to help." Brian nodded but said nothing more. Charlotte understood that building trust with him would take time. She left him to finish his sandwich and made her way toward the principal's office, her mind racing with thoughts of how she could help this quiet, lonely boy. She knocked lightly on Dr. Michael Brown's door before stepping inside. "Dr. Michael Brown, may I have a word with you?" she asked, closing the door gently behind her. The principal looked up from the stack of papers on his desk, his expression curious as Charlotte approached. Dr. Michael Brown glanced up from his desk, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Of course, Charlotte. What seems to be the issue?" he asked, his tone polite but distracted. Charlotte took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "It's about Brian, the new student," she began, her voice laced with concern. "I've noticed a few things that worry me. He always arrives in dirty clothes, and today during recess, I saw that all he had to eat was a small piece of bread. I'm really concerned about his well-being." Dr. Brown sighed, leaning back in his chair and removing his glasses. He rubbed his eyes as though the conversation was more of an inconvenience than a genuine issue. "Charlotte," he said wearily. His uncle registered him. The man seemed perfectly ordinary, and he didn't mention any problems at home. As far as the school records go, everything seems fine. Charlotte wasn't convinced and pressed further. "But Dr. Brown, don't you think the clothes, the lack of food, those are red flags? It feels like something isn't right. We have to make sure he's okay." The principal's patience was clearly wearing thin. He shook his head, his tone becoming more dismissive. "Charlotte, you're overreacting. Children come from all kinds of backgrounds, and these things are personal. You need to focus on teaching and not get too involved in matters that aren't your responsibility." A surge of frustration rose within Charlotte. She had always known that Dr. Michael Brown wasn't the most empathetic leader. His reputation for prioritizing paperwork over people was well known, but his indifference toward Brian's situation was more than she could bear. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dr. Brown, as educators, it's our duty to look after our students' well-being. If a child isn't doing well, it directly affects their ability to learn and grow. I can't ignore what I'm seeing." Dr. Brown raised his hands, signaling that the conversation was over. "Charlotte, just do your job. If there's a real problem, we'll handle it when the time comes. Now, if you don't mind, I have a lot of paperwork to get through." He motioned toward the stack of documents on his desk. Charlotte left the office feeling a mix of disappointment and helplessness. She had hoped for more support, but instead she was met with indifference. Still, she knew she couldn't ignore Brian's situation, no matter what the principal said. She was determined to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant taking matters into her own hands. Later, during recess, Charlotte's attention was drawn to an unsettling scene in the playground. She saw one of her students, a boy known for being a bit of a troublemaker, approaching Brian with a smug look on his face. The boy began taunting him, calling him poor and smelly, his words dripping with cruelty. Brian's face contorted with hurt, and it was clear he was on the verge of retaliating. But before anything could escalate, Charlotte quickly intervened, gently but firmly placing her hand on Brian's arm to stop him. She turned to the bully, her eyes serious and unwavering. "That's enough," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "Go to the office now and wait for me there. We will discuss your behavior later." The boy hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her stern tone, but eventually turned and walked toward the office. Charlotte watched him go, her heart heavy with both sadness and frustration. She then knelt down to Brian's level, her voice softening as she spoke to him. "Brian, "Are you okay?" she asked gently, searching his face for any sign of how he was feeling. Brian didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, his eyes still filled with the sting of the hurtful words. Charlotte squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "I'm here for you, Brian," she said quietly. "You don't have to face this alone." As she watched Brian return to the other children, her resolve only grew stronger. She couldn't count on the administration to take action, but she could still do everything in her power to make sure Brian felt safe and supported in her classroom. And that, she knew, would make all the difference. The boy, aware that he had gone too far, quickly turned and sprinted towards the principal's office, his steps echoing across the playground. Charlotte knelt beside Brian, who was trying his hardest to hold back tears. His small shoulders shook, and the pain from the cruel words seemed almost too much for him to bear. "Brian, don't let what he said get to you," Charlotte said softly, her voice full of warmth and care. "You are a very special boy, and you don't deserve to hear those kinds of things." Brian kept his gaze fixed on the ground, his silent tears falling onto the dirt below. Seeing just how hurt he was, Charlotte felt a surge of protectiveness. An idea formed in her mind, something simple, but perhaps it could help brighten his day. "How about we go get some ice cream? Just the two of us," she suggested, her tone light and inviting, hoping to lift his spirits. Brian looked up surprised and asked timidly, "But what about class?" "Don't worry about that," Charlotte replied with a gentle smile. "I'll ask another teacher who's free to cover my class for the rest of the day. Today is special, just for you." After some gentle persuasion, Brian finally agreed, though he remained a bit hesitant. Together they walked to a small, cozy ice cream shop just a short distance from the school. Inside, the colorful display of various ice cream flavors lit up the room, and Brian's eyes widened as he took in the sight. It was clear he wasn't used to such treats. "Choose any flavor you want," Charlotte encouraged him, her heart lifting as she watched him consider his options. He eventually chose chocolate, though he still appeared a bit shy. They sat down at a small table by the window, and as Brian began to eat his ice cream, Charlotte quietly observed him. At first he was reserved, but as the cold sweetness melted in his mouth, a genuine smile began to spread across his face. It was the first time Charlotte had seen him smile, and it filled her with hope. This was a small step, but it felt like a significant breakthrough for both of them. After their brief but meaningful outing, Charlotte returned with Brian to the school. The moment they walked through the doors, they were met by Dr. Michael Brown, who looked far from pleased. His expression was stern, and his eyes were filled with disapproval. "Charlotte, this is completely unacceptable," he began, his tone sharp. "Why did you leave the school with Brian during class hours?" Charlotte, feeling a bit apprehensive, took a deep breath before responding. "Dr. Michael Brown, after the incident at recess, Brian was very upset. I just wanted to do something to help him feel better, so we went for ice cream nearby," she explained, trying to convey her good intentions. But the principal remained unsympathetic. "That's no justification, Charlotte. What if his uncle had come to pick him up, and he wasn't here?" he asked, his voice growing more impatient. Charlotte stood her ground. "I knew the schedules, and I was certain there wouldn't be any issues. I just wanted to help him, Dr. Brown. There was no risk," she insisted, hoping to make him understand. Dr. Brown, however, was still not convinced. "Don't do this again, Charlotte. It could cause serious problems in the future," he warned. "By the way, Brian's uncle is on his way here. I've already called him to inform him about the incident." Hearing that Brian's uncle was coming, Charlotte decided to stay and wait. She felt it was important to speak with him directly, to try and get a better understanding of Brian's situation. As they waited, she kept an eye on Brian, who now seemed a bit more at ease after their ice cream trip. It was a small victory, but she knew it was just the beginning of earning his trust. When Brian's uncle finally arrived, his expression was calm. But there was a certain coldness in his gaze that unsettled Charlotte. Brian immediately went to his side, keeping his head down, as if trying to make himself invisible. The uncle turned his attention to Charlotte, his voice serious as he asked, "What happened here?" "I got a concerning call from the principal." Charlotte, choosing her words carefully, tried to explain the situation as clearly and kindly as possible. "There was an incident at recess today. Another student provoked Brian, calling him names. I stepped in before anything escalated, but Brian was very upset. I just wanted to help him calm down." Brian's uncle seemed surprised by this. Brian doesn't usually react like that. "He's a quiet boy," he said, casting a worried glance at the child, who still refused to meet anyone's gaze. Sensing that the uncle was open to conversation, but also wary, Charlotte decided to approach another sensitive topic. "I've noticed that sometimes Brian comes to school with dirty clothes and unclean nails," she said gently. "I just wanted to make sure everything is okay at home." The uncle shifted uncomfortably but didn't seem offended. "Things get a bit hectic at home sometimes," he admitted, his tone slightly defensive. "But I'll pay more attention to it." Charlotte nodded, trying to convey that she was simply concerned and wanted to help. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "If there's anything I can do to support Brian, please let me know. I just want to make sure he's okay." The uncle looked at her for a moment, his expression softening just a bit. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll keep that in mind." As Brian and his uncle walked away, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering concern. She had taken a step toward understanding Brian's world, but she knew there was still so much more to uncover. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was determined to continue being there for him, to make sure he had the support he needed, even if it meant standing up to the school administration again. Brian hesitated, his small hands clutching the bag of new clothes as he looked up at Charlotte with a mix of gratitude and fear. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "My uncle, he might not like this," he said, his eyes shifting nervously, as if even mentioning his uncle's disapproval was a risk. Charlotte's heart sank. She knelt down to meet his gaze, trying to reassure him. "Brian, these clothes are just for you. You deserve to feel comfortable at school," she said gently. "If your uncle asks, you can tell him that they were a gift from your teacher. I'm here to help you, and I want to make sure you're okay." Brian nodded slowly, still unsure but clearly touched by her gesture. "Thank you, teacher," he murmured, his voice soft but sincere. He glanced at the clothes again, as if he couldn't quite believe they were really his. Charlotte smiled warmly at him. "You're welcome, Brian. Take your time, and if you need anything, you can always come to me," she said, hoping to ease his concerns. As the day went on, Charlotte couldn't help but keep a close eye on Brian, watching for any signs of how he was feeling. He remained quiet, as usual, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a slight lift in his posture, a hint of relief in his expression. She hoped that the small gesture of kindness might be a step toward helping him feel more at ease. Later that day, when she returned home, Charlotte found Jason waiting for her, a curious look on his face. "How did it go?" he asked, eager to hear about Brian's reaction to the new clothes. Charlotte smiled as she recalled the moment. He seemed happy, but also worried about how his uncle might react, she explained. "I reassured him that the clothes were a gift from me, but I could tell there's still some fear there. I just hope it helps him feel a little more comfortable at school." Jason nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you're making progress, even if it's just small steps," he said. "Kids like Brian, they just need someone to care. And you're doing that." Charlotte sighed, feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. "I just want to make sure he knows he's not alone," she said softly. "That someone is looking out for him." Jason placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're doing more than enough, Charlotte. Just keep being there for him. Over time, he'll come to trust you more." The following days passed with Brian continuing to be reserved, but Charlotte could see the small changes. He started wearing the new clothes, and although he still kept to himself, there was a subtle sense of newfound confidence in the way he carried himself. Charlotte remained vigilant, carefully observing and gently encouraging him whenever she could. One afternoon, as the students were packing up to go home, Charlotte noticed Brian linger behind, his gaze drifting toward her as if he wanted to say something. She approached him with a kind smile. "Is everything okay, Brian?" Brian hesitated for a moment, then looked up at her, his voice barely audible. "Thank you, teacher, for the clothes," he said, his words shy but filled with genuine gratitude. Charlotte's heart warmed. "You're very welcome, Brian," she replied, her voice full of kindness. "I'm glad you like them." As he left the classroom, Charlotte felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. She knew that helping Brian would be a gradual process, but she was determined to stay by his side every step of the way. "It's just that my uncle, he told me not to accept things from other people and never to talk about our life," Brian whispered, his voice barely audible as his eyes darted around the room, full of unease. He looked as if he feared that someone might be listening, even in the safety of the classroom. Charlotte felt an icy shiver run down her spine at his words, a mixture of concern and suspicion creeping in. Why would an adult instruct a child to keep their life a secret, to refuse help? That's strange, Brian. Why do you think he would say something like that? She asked gently, trying to make sense of the situation. Brian simply shrugged, his small shoulders tense with discomfort, clearly unwilling to delve deeper into the topic. Charlotte recognized the fear in his eyes, and it only deepened her concern. Her mind drifted back to the conversation she had with his uncle the day before. Could it have triggered this reaction? Was there something more going on behind the scenes that she couldn't see? Even after speaking with Brian's uncle, Charlotte noticed that the boy still arrived at school looking neglected. His hair remained untidy, and though his nails were slightly cleaner, they still showed signs of being overlooked. The sense of dread she had been feeling only intensified when, during class, she spotted something odd about his homework. The writing in his notebook wasn't his, she was certain of it. The neatness of the letters, the way they were formed, it was nothing like Brian's usual work. As the other students filed out of the classroom, Charlotte discreetly called Brian to the side. "Brian," she said softly, showing him his notebook, "who did this homework? The handwriting doesn't look like yours." Brian dropped his gaze to the floor, his voice barely a murmur as he mumbled something incomprehensible. His reluctance to speak sent a pang of frustration and worry through Charlotte's heart. She leaned down, trying to meet his eyes. "Brian, you can trust me. If something is going on, I want to help you," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. But Brian remained silent, his lips pressed tightly together, refusing to divulge anything more. The weight of his silence felt heavy in the room, and Charlotte could sense just how trapped he felt. After the conversation, Charlotte knew she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. She felt a growing urgency, a pull to take action even if it meant crossing boundaries. It was a risky decision, but she resolved to do something that afternoon during lunch, while the principal was out. She had to check Brian's documents in Dr. Michael Brown's office. Maybe there was something in his file that could shed light on the situation. As the lunch bell rang, Charlotte discreetly watched Dr. Brown leave the school, just as he did every day. The moment he was out of sight, she moved quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Entering the principal's office felt like stepping into dangerous territory, but her determination outweighed her fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to sift through the folders, organized by year and alphabetically. She moved with a sense of urgency, her eyes scanning each label until finally she found Brian's folder. She opened it carefully, her breath catching in her throat as she began to leaf through the documents. She was searching for any clue that could help her understand more about Brian's family, especially his parents. The names of Brian's mother and father were listed in the file, but what stood out most was the name of the person who had enrolled him, his uncle, Ronald Allen. But then something even more troubling caught her eye. The section for the home address was blank. A wave of unease washed over her as she stared at the empty field. Why would someone leave such an important detail blank? It didn't make sense. Her mind raced with possibilities as she continued to search through the file, desperate to find more answers. But time seemed to slip away faster than she had realized. Just as she was putting the documents back in place, she heard the unmistakable sound of the door opening behind her. Her heart jumped into her throat as she turned around, her eyes meeting those of Dr. Michael Brown, who had returned from lunch earlier than expected. He stood there, surprise etched across his face. "Charlotte, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Charlotte's mind raced, searching for an explanation, but she knew she had been caught. The urgency of her actions had led her here, and now she had to face the consequences of crossing a line she never intended to. Charlotte felt a wave of anxiety wash over her as Brian's words echoed in her mind. His uncle's strange instruction not to go out with anyone outside of the family seemed to take on new weight. She knelt down to Brian's eye level, trying to convey a sense of calm and safety despite the unease she felt inside. "Brian, I understand that your uncle told you that, but today is a bit different," she said softly, her voice gentle and reassuring. "Your uncle is stuck and can't come to pick you up, so I'll take care of you tonight. We'll make sure you're safe, and tomorrow he'll be here to get you." Brian hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. His eyes darted around nervously, as if he was trying to figure out what to do. "But," he said, "not to go with anyone," he whispered, clearly torn between following his uncle's instructions and trusting Charlotte. Charlotte felt her heart ache for him. The conflict in his eyes was so raw, so vulnerable. She knew she had to handle this delicately. "I know it's confusing, Brian," she said softly. "But your uncle asked me to help today. I promise you'll be safe with me. We'll have dinner, and you can rest, and tomorrow everything will be back to normal. Does that sound okay?" Brian looked at her, uncertainty still clouding his face, but after a long moment he finally nodded. It wasn't a nod of complete trust, but it was enough for now. "Okay," he whispered, his voice small. As they left the school together, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. The strange secrecy, the uncle's reluctance to share details about their life, the worn clothes, the inconsistent homework, it all painted a picture of a situation far more complex than she had initially realized. But for now, her focus was on making Brian feel safe. When they arrived at Charlotte's house, Jason greeted them at the door with his usual warm smile. "Hey there, who do we have here?" he asked, his voice friendly as he crouched down to Brian's level. "This is Brian," Charlotte introduced. "He'll be staying with us tonight. His uncle couldn't pick him up, so we're helping him out." Jason's eyes flicked to Charlotte's with a hint of concern, but he quickly masked it with a reassuring smile for Brian. "Well, you're in for a treat, Brian. We're having homemade pizza tonight. Do you like pizza?" Brian nodded slightly, his eyes scanning the room, still a bit hesitant, but clearly intrigued by the idea of pizza. "Yes," he replied quietly. "Great. Let's get you settled in," then Jason said warmly, leading them inside. As the evening progressed, Charlotte noticed that Brian began to relax, little by little. He ate his pizza quietly, but with growing confidence, and when Jason turned on a light-hearted movie, Brian even cracked a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Later, as Charlotte prepared a spare bed for Brian, she couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. Something about Ronald's call and his insistence on secrecy gnawed at her. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, trying to help Brian without crossing lines that could make things worse. But one thing was clear: this little boy needed someone to look out for him, and she wasn't about to turn her back on that responsibility. When it was time for bed, Brian quietly crawled under the covers, his small form almost disappearing in the blankets. Charlotte sat beside him for a moment, her heart heavy with concern. "If you need anything, I'm just down the hall, okay?" she said softly. Brian nodded, his eyes already beginning to droop with sleep. "Thank you, teacher," he whispered, his voice barely audible. As Charlotte quietly left the room and closed the door behind her, she felt a deep sense of both relief and responsibility. She knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger, and she couldn't predict where it would lead. But for now, Brian was safe, and that was enough to ease her worries, if only for a little while. Charlotte's heart sank as she listened to Brian's trembling voice, full of fear and uncertainty. She could see that the boy was deeply conflicted, caught between his loyalty to his uncle and the quiet desperation for safety that his body language betrayed. Trying not to show her growing concern, she offered him a gentle smile, wanting nothing more than to reassure him. "Of course, Brian," she said softly. "You can go to sleep now. You've had a long day," she watched as Brian climbed into the bed, pulling the covers up around him, his small frame almost disappearing beneath the blankets. There was so much he wasn't saying, and it worried her deeply. But for now, she knew she had to respect his boundaries. Pushing him too hard might only scare him more. She sat by his bedside for a moment, watching as his eyes slowly began to close, the weight of the day finally pulling him into sleep. "If you need anything during the night, don't hesitate to call for me, okay?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he was still awake to hear her. As she quietly left the room, closing the door behind her, Charlotte felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. There was something deeply troubling about Brian's situation, and the more she tried to piece it together, the more uneasy she became. His fear of upsetting his uncle, his reluctance to speak about his life at home, the way he seemed almost conditioned to keep quiet, it all pointed to something bigger, something she couldn't ignore. When she returned to the living room, Jason was sitting on the couch, his face etched with concern. "How is he?" he asked softly, glancing toward the hallway where Brian's room was. Charlotte let out a heavy sigh as she sat down next to him. "He's asleep now, but Jason, I'm really worried about him," she admitted, her voice filled with emotion. "He keeps saying that his uncle wouldn't like him being here, that he's afraid of upsetting him. And when I tried to ask him about what's going on at home, he shut down completely." Jason reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It sounds like he's dealing with a lot more than we realize," he said quietly. "But you're doing everything you can to help him. Just being here for him tonight might be more than he's ever had." Charlotte nodded, appreciating Jason's steady support, but the weight of the situation still lingered heavily in her mind. "I just wish I knew what was really happening at home," she murmured. "I feel like there's something he's too scared to talk about, and that scares me." Jason looked thoughtful for a moment before he spoke again. "Maybe we can try to build his trust over time. If he sees that we're here for him, no matter what, maybe he'll eventually open up." Charlotte looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You're right," she said softly. "I just have to be patient and let him know that I'm here whenever he's ready." As the night wore on, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to her. She found herself checking on Brian multiple times throughout the evening, making sure he was still peacefully asleep. Each time she stood in the doorway, watching his small form rise and fall with steady breaths, and each time she whispered a silent promise to herself that she would find a way to help him. In the quiet of the night, as Charlotte finally lay down to sleep, she couldn't stop thinking about Brian's thin frame, his worn-out shoes, and the fear that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Whatever was going on in his life, she knew she couldn't let it go unaddressed. Tomorrow she would continue to watch over him, to protect him in any way she could. And maybe, Just maybe, she would find a way to reach the frightened little boy who had come into her care and help him find the safety and peace he so desperately needed. Charlotte felt a tightening in her chest as she heard Brian's quiet plea. The vulnerability in his voice, his admission of constant hunger, cut through her like a knife. She forced a smile to keep her composure, trying to offer him the warmth and security he so clearly lacked. "Of course, Brian," she said gently. "I'll make sure you have a nice snack to take with you." As she began preparing the food, carefully wrapping up the bread and adding a few extra items, she couldn't stop thinking about what Brian had just revealed. The fact that he was often hungry, that there wasn't always enough food at home, it confirmed her worst fears. There was something seriously wrong in his life, and it was more than she had initially imagined. While she worked, Brian stood by quietly, watching her with wide, attentive eyes. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, he said, "It must be really nice to have a family that takes care of you like this." Those words struck Charlotte and Jason to their core. The longing in Brian's voice was unmistakable, and it broke their hearts to realize just how deprived he had been of the basic comforts and love that every child deserves. Charlotte glanced at Jason, her eyes brimming with emotion. She could see that he was just as affected as she was. Jason cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "You know, Brian," he began gently, "families come in all different shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're not what you'd expect, but the most important thing is that there are people who care about you." Brian looked up at him, his eyes full of uncertainty, as if he was trying to understand a concept that had always felt distant to him. The boy nodded slightly but remained quiet, lost in thought. The moment was heavy with unspoken emotions, and Charlotte couldn't help but wonder how much Brian had been through, how much he had kept hidden behind his silence and fear. Once the snack was prepared, Charlotte handed it to Brian with a warm smile. "Here you go, Brian. I hope this helps you a little today," she said, her voice full of kindness. Brian took the bag from her, his small hands clutching it tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. The weight of what he had shared hung in the air, and Charlotte knew that this was just the beginning. There was so much more to uncover, so much more to do to help this little boy who had found his way into their lives. After breakfast, Charlotte knelt down beside Brian, looking into his eyes with gentle determination. "Brian, if you ever need anything, anything at all, you can always come to me. You're not alone," she said softly, hoping to plant a seed of trust in him. Brian nodded, but Charlotte could see the uncertainty still lingering in his gaze. She knew it would take time for him to fully believe her words, but she was willing to give him all the time he needed. She wouldn't let him face his challenges alone, no matter how difficult it became. As the morning wore on, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that they were at a turning point. She and Jason had taken a step toward becoming a source of stability and care for Brian, but they both knew that much more needed to be done. They exchanged a look filled with silent understanding. Whatever the future held, they were in this together, and they wouldn't stop until Brian was safe and cared for in every way possible. Charlotte's heart raced as she followed Ronald's car, her mind swirling with thoughts of Brian and the desperation she had seen in his eyes. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, determined to find out where Ronald was taking him. Every fiber of her being screamed that something wasn't right, and she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. She kept a careful distance, her eyes locked on the car ahead. What is this man hiding, she wondered, anxiety gnawing at her as she drove. She knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and she could jeopardize Brian's safety. But the thought of losing him, of not knowing what he was going through, was unbearable. As the car wound through unfamiliar streets, Charlotte's mind raced with possibilities. Should she call the police? What if Ronald noticed her following him? What if she made things worse? These questions kept her on edge, but her resolve didn't waver. She had to protect Brian, even if it meant stepping into dangerous territory. After what felt like an eternity, Ronald's car finally pulled into the driveway of a modest, run-down house at the edge of town. Charlotte parked a safe distance away, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Ronald roughly pull Brian from the car. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his small body tense with fear. Charlotte watched in silent horror as Ronald dragged Brian toward the house. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the boy's resistance, the way he tried to pull away, only to be met with firm, unyielding force. "I need to do something," Charlotte thought, her pulse quickening. She glanced down at her phone, debating whether to make the call. But she knew she needed more information, something concrete to tell the authorities. For now, she had to wait and watch, as painful as that was. She waited until Ronald and Brian disappeared inside the house before quietly stepping out of her car. Keeping a safe distance, she circled around the property, searching for any sign of what might be going on inside. The curtains were drawn tightly, but through a small gap, she could see a sliver of movement, Ronald pacing, and Brian sitting still, head down. Charlotte felt her stomach turn as she realized how powerless she was in that moment. But she knew she couldn't act recklessly. If Ronald found out she was there, it could make things much worse for Brian. Taking a deep breath, she carefully backed away and returned to her car. Her mind was racing with what she had just seen, but she needed to think clearly. This situation was far more dangerous than she had anticipated, and it was clear that Ronald was not a man to be taken lightly. Once safely back in her car, Charlotte pulled out her phone and dialed Jason's number. As soon as he picked up, she quickly explained what had happened, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and urgency. "Jason, I followed Ronald. He took Brian to a house on the outskirts of town. Something isn't right, I'm sure of it, but I don't know what to do. I'm scared for Brian." Jason's voice was calm but serious. "Charlotte, you need to call the authorities. You can't handle this alone. If you're worried for Brian's safety, it's time to get the police involved. We can't risk something happening to him." Charlotte hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But she knew Jason was right. This had gone far beyond her ability to manage on her own. She couldn't protect Brian by herself, not against whatever was going on in that house. "Okay," she finally said, her voice steadying. "I'll call them." After ending the call with Jason, Charlotte took a deep breath and dialed the number for the local police. Her hands were shaking as she explained the situation, detailing everything she had seen and her growing concern for Brian's well-being. The officer on the other end of the line listened carefully, asking questions about Ronald, the house, and Brian's behavior. Charlotte provided as much information as she could, her heart pounding as she relived the events of the day. "We'll send a unit out to the address you provided," the officer said firmly. "Stay where you are and don't approach the house. Let us handle it." Charlotte agreed, though every instinct in her body told her to rush back to the house and protect Brian herself. But she knew she had to trust the authorities now. She had done everything she could, and now it was in their hands. As she waited in her car, every minute felt like an hour. The silence around her was suffocating, and her mind was filled with images of Brian, his tear-streaked face, his pleas for help, the fear in his eyes. She gripped the steering wheel, praying that she had made the right decision, that help would arrive in time to protect him. Finally, she saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching the house. She watched as the officers got out and approached the door, her heart in her throat as she waited for any sign of what was happening inside. Minutes later, one of the officers stepped back outside, leading Ronald in handcuffs. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she saw Brian emerge behind him, escorted by another officer. The boy looked shaken, but he was safe. Tears welled up in Charlotte's eyes as she watched the scene unfold. She had done it, she had taken the steps necessary to protect Brian. But she knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more questions, more challenges ahead. But for now, she could breathe a little easier, knowing that Brian was out of harm's way, at least for the moment. As the police car pulled away, Charlotte sat in her car, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She had faced her fears and done what was right, but the weight of it all still pressed heavily on her. There was so much more to uncover, so much more to do. But for now, Brian was safe, and that was all that mattered. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she peered through the grimy window, her heart aching at the sight of Brian sitting helplessly on the dirty, stained mattress. The boy's face was pale, his small frame trembling as tears streamed down his cheeks. She could hear Ronald's voice inside, cold and firm, trying to silence the child's sobs. "Brian, stop crying. This had to be done. You'll understand later," Ronald said, his tone devoid of warmth or comfort. It sent a shiver down Charlotte's spine. Whatever Ronald's intentions were, it was clear that this was no place for a child. Charlotte's mind raced as she crouched beneath the window, trying to figure out her next move. She couldn't wait for Jason to arrive. Every moment she delayed could put Brian in even more danger. She needed to act now, but she knew she had to be smart about it. She couldn't let Ronald know she was there, not yet. She quickly reached for her phone and sent Jason a text with her exact location. "I found them. It's bad, Jason. Please hurry." She then dialed 911, her voice low but urgent as she relayed her situation to the dispatcher. "I'm at an isolated shack, and a child is in danger. His name is Brian, and he's with his uncle, Ronald Allen. Please send help immediately." The dispatcher asked her to stay on the line, but Charlotte couldn't risk Ronald hearing her voice. "I have to stay hidden," she whispered. "Please send help as fast as you can." She ended the call and took a deep breath, her eyes darting between the shack and the surrounding woods. She had to be careful. If Ronald realized she was there, things could escalate quickly. From her position, Charlotte could hear the muffled conversation inside the shack. Ronald's voice grew more impatient as Brian's quiet sobs continued. "I told you, Brian. You'll thank me for this one day," Ronald muttered. His words were cryptic, but Charlotte could hear the frustration in his voice. He seemed like a man pushed to his limits, and that thought terrified her. Carefully, Charlotte crept closer to the door, trying to get a better sense of what was happening inside. She could see a rusty old lock on the door, but it didn't look like it would take much to break. Her hands trembled as she weighed her options. She couldn't wait for the police to arrive. Brian needed her now. Steeling herself, Charlotte made her decision. She found a small rock near the side of the shack and silently approached the door. With a quick, deliberate motion, she hit the lock with the rock, and it snapped open with a soft clink. She held her breath, praying that the noise hadn't alerted Ronald inside. The next few moments felt like a blur. Charlotte carefully pushed the door open just a crack, enough to see inside. Ronald was standing with his back to the door, his focus on Brian, who sat on the mattress with wide, terrified eyes. Charlotte could see the desperation in the boy's gaze as he looked up at Ronald. Gathering every ounce of courage she had, Charlotte pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. "Brian, come here," she whispered urgently, her eyes locked on the boy. Brian's eyes flicked to Charlotte, a flicker of hope in his expression. Ronald turned sharply at the sound of her voice, his face twisting in shock and anger. "What are you doing here?" he growled, taking a step toward her. Charlotte stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm here to take Brian with me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "This isn't right, Ronald. He needs to be safe." Ronald's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Charlotte feared he might lash out. But then, something shifted in his expression. He hesitated, glancing between Brian and Charlotte, as if weighing his options. "You don't understand," Ronald muttered, his voice shaky. "I'm doing this for him. He needs to learn." Charlotte cut him off, her voice firm. What Brian needs is safety and care, Ronald. You're hurting him. Let him go." There was a tense silence as Ronald stared at her, his hands clenched at his sides. Then, finally, he took a step back. "Take him," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just take him and go." Without wasting a second, Charlotte rushed forward, scooping Brian up into her arms. The boy clung to her tightly, his small body trembling with relief. Charlotte backed away toward the door, never taking her eyes off Ronald, who stood frozen in place, a look of defeat on his face. As soon as she was outside, Charlotte ran toward her car, holding Brian close. She could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching, and for the first time since this terrifying ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Help was on the way. When she reached the car, she gently placed Brian in the passenger seat, her hands shaking as she buckled him in. "It's going to be okay, Brian," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair away from his tear-streaked face. "You're safe now." Brian nodded, his voice too choked with emotion to speak, but his grip on her hand said everything. He trusted her. She had kept her promise. As the police cars pulled up beside them, Charlotte knew that this was just the beginning of Brian's journey toward healing, but she was ready to stand by his side, no matter what. Charlotte hesitated as she stepped into the shack, her senses immediately overwhelmed by the stifling atmosphere inside. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of neglect, and the dim light barely illuminated the cramped space. Plastic bottles and discarded items were scattered across the floor, adding to the sense of disarray. Her eyes drifted to Brian, who clung to her side, his small body trembling with fear and uncertainty. She tightened her arm around him, silently promising to protect him. Ronald motioned toward an old, worn-out chair. "Please sit down," he said, his voice strained. He ran a hand through his hair, visibly stressed. Charlotte, her heart pounding in her chest, cautiously took a seat, keeping Brian close beside her. She was on high alert, ready to react if anything felt off. Ronald began pacing the small room, his eyes darting around as if searching for the right words. He seemed conflicted, his usual stern demeanor replaced by a mixture of anxiety and guilt. "I'm not a bad person," he repeated, almost as if trying to convince himself as much as Charlotte. "You have to understand, I'm just trying to protect Brian." Charlotte's mind raced as she tried to piece together what Ronald was saying. She remained quiet, letting him speak, but her thoughts were on Brian and the trauma he must have been enduring in this environment. His mother. "She left," Ronald finally said, his voice faltering. "She couldn't handle it anymore, raising him on her own. So I took Brian in, tried to give him some stability. But it's been hard, really hard." He stopped pacing and looked directly at Charlotte, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. Charlotte listened intently, still trying to remain calm despite the growing tension. "Why didn't you ask for help, Ronald?" she asked gently. "There are resources available that could support both you and Brian." Ronald shook his head, his expression darkening. "I didn't want anyone getting involved. I thought I could manage on my own. But they got out of control. I lost my job, and we've been struggling ever since." His voice lowered as he continued. "That's why I wanted to move him to another school. I thought maybe a fresh start would be better for him, away from all the questions." Charlotte's heart ached as she listened. Ronald's misguided attempts to shield Brian from the world had only isolated the boy further. It was clear that Ronald was overwhelmed and didn't know how to handle the situation, but his decisions had put Brian in a vulnerable and unsafe position. "Ronald," she said softly, "I understand that you've been trying to do your best, but this isn't the way. Brian needs more than just survival. He needs a safe, nurturing environment where he can grow and thrive. And that's not something you can do alone. You need help, and there's no shame in that." Ronald's face crumpled with the weight of his emotions, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Finally, he let out a long, shaky breath. "You're right," he admitted quietly. I can't do this on my own anymore." Charlotte nodded, relieved that he was finally opening up. "We can figure this out together," she assured him. "But first, we need to make sure Brian is safe. I can help you connect with the right people, Ronald. You don't have to do this alone." As the tension in the room began to ease, Charlotte glanced down at Brian, who was still clinging to her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. She gently stroked his hair, trying to comfort him. "Brian, it's going to be okay," she whispered. "We're going to make sure everything gets better." Ronald, visibly worn out, sat down on the edge of the mattress and buried his face in his hands. "I just want what's best for him," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "But I've made so many mistakes." Charlotte reached out, her voice soft but firm. "The best thing you can do for Brian right now is to get help. There's still time to make things right." As she spoke, she heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Relief washed over her. Help was finally on the way. Ronald looked up, his expression a mix of resignation and relief, as he realized that the authorities were about to arrive. "They're coming to help," Ronald, Charlotte said gently. "Let's make sure Brian gets the care he needs. This is the first step toward making things better." Ronald nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He didn't resist as the police cars pulled up outside, and moments later, officers entered the shack, assessing the situation with calm professionalism. Charlotte stood up, still holding Brian close, and explained everything that had happened. The officers listened carefully, and after a few moments of discussion, they gently escorted Ronald outside. As the officers led Ronald away, Charlotte knelt down beside Brian and hugged him tightly. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I promise everything's going to be okay." Brian clung to her, his tears subsiding as he began to trust in the warmth and safety of her embrace. Charlotte knew there was a long road ahead, but she was ready to walk it with him. This was just the beginning of their journey toward healing and hope. Charlotte sat silently for a moment, processing everything Ronald had just shared. The story was far more complex and heartbreaking than she had imagined. Ronald wasn't just a man in over his head, he was a desperate uncle trying to shield his nephew from a dangerous past, doing the best he could with almost nothing. The weight of his sacrifices hit her deeply, and she felt a swell of compassion for both Ronald and Brian. The image of Brian, sitting on that worn mattress, struggling with hunger and fear, haunted her. And Ronald, who had given up so much, living in such dire conditions, had done it all out of love and a fierce determination to protect his nephew. Charlotte knew they couldn't continue living like this, but she also understood that simply calling the authorities might not be the best solution, especially if Brian's biological father was as dangerous as Ronald described. She took a deep breath and looked Ronald in the eye, her voice gentle but firm. "Ronald, I see how much you care about Brian, and I know you've made sacrifices for him. But this situation hiding out in this shack, barely scraping by, it's not sustainable. You can't protect him forever by isolating him. There are ways to keep him safe. But you need help. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Ronald looked down, his face a mixture of shame and relief. "I don't know what else to do," he admitted. "I've been so afraid of losing him, of his father finding us. I don't know where to turn." Charlotte reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "We can figure this out together. There are organizations that can help, people who can provide legal support to protect Brian from his father. And I know you want to give Brian a better life, and that starts with getting him the support he needs." Ronald looked up, his eyes searching hers for a sign of hope. "But what if they take him away from me?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. "I can't lose him, Charlotte. He's all I have." Charlotte squeezed his arm gently, trying to offer him some comfort. "We'll make sure that doesn't happen. I'll help you find the right resources, and we'll work together to make sure Brian stays safe and gets the life he deserves. But we need to take the next step, Ronald. We can't keep hiding." Ronald sat quietly for a moment, processing her words. Then, with a slow nod, he seemed to come to a decision. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll trust you. I don't know what the future holds, but I'll do whatever it takes to keep Brian safe." Charlotte felt a surge of relief wash over her. This was the breakthrough she had hoped for. "We'll get through this together," she said gently. "You're not alone anymore." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Outside, the sound of birds chirping in the distance seemed to signal a small sense of peace, as if the world outside had momentarily paused to give them a brief respite from the chaos. After a few moments, Charlotte stood up and said, "I'm going to make some calls. I know some people who can help with legal advice and social services. We'll figure out how to protect Brian and keep you both safe." Ronald nodded again, still looking uncertain but willing to trust her. As Charlotte stepped outside the shack, she saw Brian peeking out from the small room where Ronald had sent him. His eyes were filled with a mix of fear and hope, as if he could sense that something had changed. She knelt down to his level, offering him a warm smile. "Brian, everything's going to be okay," she said softly. "We're going to make sure you're safe, and we'll take care of you." Brian hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked over to her, wrapping his small arms around her neck in a tight hug. Charlotte held him close, feeling the weight of his trust and the responsibility that came with it. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to help Brian and Ronald find a way forward. As she hugged Brian, Charlotte glanced back at the shack and saw Ronald watching them, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. She knew that this was only the beginning of their journey, but for the first time, there was hope that things could change, that they could build a better future for Brian. With that thought in mind, Charlotte stood up, still holding Brian's hand, and began making calls. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to fight for them both. Days passed, and with each one, hope grew stronger for Ronald and Brian. Charlotte and Jason's home had become a temporary refuge, filled with warmth and care that both Ronald and Brian had long been deprived of. Brian, who had been so withdrawn and scared, slowly began to open up, enjoying the simple pleasures of playing with toys, laughing, and being a kid again. The tension that had hung over him like a cloud started to lift, and it was clear that he felt safe for the first time in a long while. Ronald, though still cautious, seemed to be breathing a little easier. He spent his days helping around the house and talking with Jason and the lawyer. The fear of losing Brian was still very real, but knowing that there was legal support on his side gave him a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. Jason's lawyer friend had been tireless in his efforts, and with each piece of evidence he uncovered, Ronald's case grew stronger. It turned out that Brian's father was indeed a dangerous man fugitive from the law, with a history of criminal activity that included theft, assault, and a range of other offenses. The lawyer had collected witness statements, police reports, and other crucial documents that painted a damning picture of Brian's father, making it clear that Ronald's fears were not unfounded. Charlotte spent her days caring for Brian, ensuring that he had everything he needed. She often found herself reflecting on how much the little boy had endured, and she was determined to do everything in her power to help him find peace. She also knew that this journey wasn't just about Brian, it was about Ronald too. He had sacrificed everything to protect his nephew, and now it was time for someone to stand by him and offer him the support he deserved. Finally, the day came when they had to present their case before a judge. Charlotte, Jason, Ronald, and the lawyer gathered at the courthouse, each of them filled with nervous anticipation. Brian, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, sat quietly with Charlotte, his small hand clutching hers. In the courtroom, the lawyer presented the evidence with clarity and conviction. He spoke of Ronald's dedication to Brian, the sacrifices he had made, and the danger that Brian's father posed. He also emphasized how Ronald had done everything in his power to protect the boy, even if it meant living in isolation and poverty. The judge listened intently, his face unreadable as he considered the facts before him. When it was Ronald's turn to speak, his voice trembled with emotion as he recounted his story, his sister's struggles, her tragic death, and the vow he had made to keep Brian safe. He spoke of the fear that had driven him to run, the desperation that had led him to hide in that shack, and the helplessness he felt as he watched his nephew suffer. But he also spoke of the hope that had been restored by Charlotte and Jason's kindness, and the belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As Ronald finished his testimony, the courtroom fell silent. The judge took a few moments to review the case before delivering his decision. Ronald Allen. The judge began, his voice steady. It is clear that you have done everything in your power to protect your nephew under incredibly difficult circumstances. The evidence presented here leaves no doubt that Brian's father is a threat to his safety and well-being. Therefore, I am granting you full custody of Brian, with the condition that you receive support from social services to ensure that Brian is raised in a safe and nurturing environment. A wave of relief washed over the room. Ronald's shoulders sagged with the weight of the judge's words, and tears filled his eyes as he realized that he had won. Brian was safe. He wouldn't have to run anymore. Charlotte squeezed Brian's hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the outcome. Jason placed a reassuring hand on Ronald's shoulder, offering him a smile of support. They had all fought for this moment, and now it was finally here. As they left the courtroom, Brian looked up at Charlotte, a shy smile on his face. "Does this mean we don't have to hide anymore?" he asked quietly. Charlotte knelt down to his level, her heart full of warmth. "That's right, Brian. You're safe now. You can live like a normal kid, play, and go to school without being afraid." Brian's smile grew wider, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no fear in his eyes, only hope. Over the following months, with the help of social services and the continued support of Charlotte, Jason, and their lawyer, Ronald and Brian began to rebuild their lives. They moved into a small but comfortable apartment, and Ronald found work that allowed him to provide for Brian in a stable and healthy environment. Brian returned to school, where he thrived, no longer burdened by the weight of his past. And while the road ahead was still filled with challenges, they knew they weren't walking it alone. They had found a new family in Charlotte and Jason, and together, they were determined to create a future where Brian could grow up safe, happy, and loved. The day had finally arrived when hope replaced fear, and relief washed over everyone in the room. Ronald stood in Charlotte and Jason's living room, overwhelmed with emotion as the weight of months of anxiety lifted off his shoulders. The judge's decision to grant him custody of Brian felt like a lifeline, and he could barely process the news. Tears ran down his weathered face as he looked at Charlotte and Jason, who had become his unexpected saviors. "I don't know how to thank you," Ronald whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my nephew's life, and mine." As they celebrated the good news, the phone rang, and Jason answered, his face lighting up with more news from the lawyer. "Brian's father has been arrested," he announced. "The police caught him during an operation this morning." Ronald stood there in stunned silence. The nightmare he had lived in constant fear of was finally over. Brian's father, the source of so much terror, was no longer a threat. Ronald could hardly believe it after all this time. They were finally free. With all the legal hurdles behind them, Charlotte and Jason had one final surprise. Jason handed Ronald an envelope, his voice calm yet filled with compassion. "Ronald, this is half of the money we were saving for our new house. We know you need it more right now. Use it to find a place to live, buy food, clothes, whatever you need. Money comes and goes, but what's important is that you and Brian get a fresh start." Ronald looked at the envelope, his hands shaking as he held it. He couldn't find the words to express the gratitude that flooded his heart. "I don't know what to say. This is too generous," he stammered, his voice choked with tears. Charlotte stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "And there's more, Ronald," she said with a warm smile. "Jason has a position open at the restaurant where he works. It's a waiter's job, and the pay is good. He's willing to teach you everything you need to know." Ronald stood in disbelief, still processing the kindness that surrounded him. "I never imagined receiving so much help. How can I ever thank you?" Jason smiled warmly. "Just accept it, Ronald. You've been through enough. You deserve this chance to start over, and we're happy to help." As the conversation unfolded, Brian watched everything with wide, hopeful eyes. His heart felt light for the first time in what seemed like forever. Unable to contain his joy, he ran to Charlotte and Jason, throwing his small arms around them. "I won't have to leave school," he exclaimed, his voice filled with excitement. "We'll have a place to live, and I can play with my friends." Brian then turned to Ronald, his face glowing with happiness. "Uncle, we'll be okay now, right?" Ronald knelt down and embraced Brian tightly, tears of relief and joy streaming down his face. "Yes, Brian," he whispered, his voice full of love and gratitude. "We'll be okay now. Everything is going to be okay." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their new family, Ronald and Brian knew that they had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild their lives, to find peace, and to finally live without fear. With Charlotte and Jason by their side, they were ready to face the future with hope, knowing that they would never have to go through it alone. Brian's words hung in the air, filling the room with a warmth that reached deep into everyone's hearts. "You know," he said softly, looking at Charlotte and Jason, "I learned in school what a family is, and family is where there's love and care. Thank you for being my family too." The simplicity of his statement, yet the depth of its meaning, moved everyone. Charlotte and Jason exchanged glances, their eyes filled with emotion. They knew then that they had made a real difference, not just in Brian's life but in Ronald's as well. Without saying a word, they both embraced Ronald and Brian, sealing the bond that had formed between them. They had become a new kind of family, one brought together by love, compassion, and the shared belief that no one should have to face life's challenges alone. As they held each other close, there was no need for more words. The future looked brighter, and they knew that, together, they could overcome anything that came their way. What have you learned from this heartwarming yet intense journey with Charlotte, Brian, and Ronald? Reflect on the moments that touched your heart and ask yourself, what is one thing you've learned today that you will bring into practice in your own life? Comment below and share your thoughts with us. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.